everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. Today we're going to be answering your questions again, so let's jump right in. This listener shares, I work at a well-established restaurant in San Francisco and manage a team of about 20 people. Being in the restaurant industry, I feel like there's a lack of commitment to the company by the employees. There's also a few different big personalities that sometimes clash. I'm struggling with making my team care more while figuring out how to navigate through the challenges of getting a team to communicate and work together in such a high-stress and fast-paced environment.
We get it. We hear you. Concerned in San Francisco. You may not know this about the team at Radical Candor, but many of us actually started our working lives in the food service industry. And I have an appreciation for just how difficult it is to get people to work together when stress is high, especially when the pace of work is so high, because it can be really hard just to even slow down for a second to question what is going on, let alone to address a problem that you might observe. So you have my deep empathy for this. And I think the place that I wanted to start is just to think about what it means, what it means to be committed to the kind of work that you have to do in food service, because there's two parts, right? There's the mechanical part, and then there's the like customer service piece. And those things go together to create an experience for like the person on the other side, for customers. And so I think one of my observations is that in these situations, it's often the case that people may not necessarily understand the full impact of their work, right? So to take a simple example, like when you say well-established, I'm also like making an assumption about upscale, but maybe that's not true. But I was thinking like upscale restaurant experience, like a plate comes out, it like looks a certain way, right? It's been presented a certain way. The edges of the plate are clean. And I think when I first started in the industry, one thing that I wasn't really clear on is like, why do we take so much time to like make sure that those things were true? And it wasn't until I got older and I started to understand a little bit more about the science of like how we eat and what our experience of eating actually is that, I started to understand, like we actually eat that dish with our eyes first, right? Like we like look at it, we're noticing things. So like, the plate comes out dirty, like with a little drip on the outside. And we think, well, maybe that's not a big deal. It's a tiny drip. But like in my mind, as the person who's receiving that, I might be thinking, well, if they didn't care enough to wipe the drip off the edge of the plate, like what else didn't they care enough about in making this food for me? I think there's a piece of this that often doesn't get discussed because we're so busy. We don't talk about what type of experience it is that we're trying to create. And I think that can leave people feeling really disconnected, because if I don't understand the value of doing a good job, I think it's hard to be motivated to do a good job. And that may have something to do with the company culture, but it may also be the culture of the work itself, like how we relate to the work that we're doing.
Yeah, what's interesting about this whole idea of care, and when I'm reading through the question again, the second or third sentence was being in the restaurant industry, I feel like there's a lack of commitment to the company for the employees. And I think what's really interesting is, we think about care personally. I mean, it's very much about sort of this human to human connection. So kind of company aside, that we're building a team of people that hopefully they care about each other as humans, and then they care about the humans that they're giving the food to, and so even this, like we see it with our eyes as we're eating, but eating as, especially as an experience. I mean, you can walk into different restaurants and just have a different energy of, what it feels like to be in a restaurant. And so I think it's interesting if the expectation is that first the employees care about the company rather than sort of each other and the people that they're serving, let alone the people that brought the food in and sort of that whole experience, what you're saying. So we're trying to create an experience that starts first in a very human to human way that I didn't really see in that question, that was really where they were anchoring on care first about the people to people relationship.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because I definitely noticed that too. And I sort of like answered a question that wasn't asked, which is like, how do you get people to care about the work that they're doing in food service? I think there's an unhealthy assumption in here that like the way that you get that is to make them feel committed to the company, because I think there's like a lot going on there. Like I've definitely worked in restaurants where the company wasn't great, but the team that I worked with was great and we did great work. And I've worked in restaurants where like all those things were aligned, where the company was great and the team was great. And I've also worked in restaurants where none of those things were aligned. The team was terrible. The company was terrible. The food was also pretty bad. These things tend to be related in my experience. But that idea that the sort of like commitment to the company, I think really boils down to a misapprehension about the sort of like authority that should come with, being a part of a company. A much more likely way to achieve the result that this person is looking for is to get people committed to creating a great experience for their customers, because that's going to translate directly into, especially, well, we don't know for sure, but almost all restaurants are, tip driven businesses for servers. Like, great experiences for customers translates into more tips. And so there's like this really positive feedback loop that happens in those businesses, which I think can be really helpful. I think if you're trying to create a commitment with the company needs to return that commitment, right? Like, there needs to be investment in both directions.
And I would say, it's not just restaurants, although, Jason, as you say, we've all had our experiences in the restaurant industry. Mine was very short-lived and involved too much interaction with mayonnaise, which I have a visceral loathing for. Couldn't
just
do
eggs
it.
and oil.
And it's ironic because I love eggs and I love oil, but I don't like mayonnaise. So I'm not sure the teamwork of the eggs and oil do not work for me. But I will say that, Jason, to your point, like, we work with groups where, the whole company is committed to radical candor and the culture is thriving. And that's one example. We also will work with a group that's kind of trying to do it on their own. And that can be challenging, but as a team. And so I think part of it is that agency, and the person writing in is not one of the 20 people, but is actually the manager. And I'm curious, do they have the sort of their finger on the pulse of what actually a thriving universe in that restaurant would look like? Have they actually asked the people that are on the ground?
My sense is, like, by and large, people want to care about their work, right? They want to feel like the work matters, it's making a difference, it's meaningful. And so when I work with a team of people and they don't seem to really care, like, what I hear is, I don't think they've been given a reason to care. I don't think they've necessarily been set an example of like why it matters to care. And what I was trying to say with the tips thing is, like, in this industry in particular, there's this really direct relationship between like positive financial outcomes for people and caring about the work that they're doing. In some ways, I think it's easier to make those connections. Like, that's a support to making that connection.
Yeah. You have pretty quick data, like, on return on, like, I felt cared for, and you get, 20% tip or 30% tip versus 10%.
Yeah, exactly. So I think a big part of a leader's role is to help paint a picture of where they're trying, like, where the team is actually trying to go. It might be the case that he has a bunch of wrong people in the wrong place, but my guess is that that's probably not true, that he has a lot of people on his team who do care really deeply. And the thing that's missing is sort of the envisioned end state, like where they are trying to get to and how they're going to know if they're successful. That's fundamentally not about commitment to the company. That's really about commitment to the work. And I think that means elevating the work, right? That means showing people why what they're doing is important. That means valuing the work. It's easy for people who have never worked in this industry to have a misunderstanding or misapprehension about what it takes in order to be successful, to deliver dinner to a table of 8 people where all the food comes out at the same time and all the drink orders are correct and everybody gets, the modification that they asked for, right? No gluten in this one and no dairy in that one. The coordination, the like intellectual and physical labor to like make all of that happen, we need to elevate that. You want people to be proud of that work. Those things go a long way to getting people excited about the work. And that's when I think people can really start to care. In addition to like the impact on customers and ultimately the financial impact on them, like the tips that they would get back, I think when we elevate those things, that's what helps people care. And this translates across industries as well. I think the clearer teams are about what it is that they're trying to do, the better the performance is that they're going to get out of the individual players on that team. Like in my mind, I would think about those couple of things. One, is the benefit, is the positive outcome, is the goal that this team has, is that clear? Number two, like, are we celebrating the work? Like, are we celebrating when we do a good job? Are we recognizing good work? And number three, like, is the connection explicit? Do people know whether they're doing a good job? Those are the three things that I would be thinking about if I was in this person's position, because if those things are clear and people are still struggling to care about the work, then maybe you need new people. If those things are clear, there's someone out there who would want to do that job and be excited about communicating about it.
Jason, before we get off this question, I did hear that you worked at a restaurant run by the mob. What did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, this was many, many moons ago. This is 20 years ago now. And
So you feel safe talking about it now?
Well, I won't even tell you where it was in the country. What was interesting about that experience, I was totally oblivious at first. And there was like a series of things that happened where you're like, a customer didn't pay their bill and they sort of roughed them up in the parking lot. And I was like, that's odd. That's never happened at any restaurant that I've ever worked at. It was interesting because like the end result was they really tried to do right. They made him come back and leave $100 tip for the waitress that had served them. What I experienced there was, that was definitely a case where the business is what mattered. It was in a high traffic sort of vacation area, and they were like super focused on turning over tables. So if people weren't ordering drinks, they weren't ordering. Yes, not flipping the table literally, but turning over tables, meaning getting people in and out. If people weren't eating or drinking, they were like, you need to move along, pal. Don't take up space in my restaurant. It sort of taught me that there are multiple things that you can value, because I definitely worked in other places where like what they cared about was the quality of the food or drinks that people got. And it created a very different environment. Like in that environment, it was sort of, I don't want to say it was hostile, but there was this sort of like mild tension between servers and people in the restaurant. Whereas like in the other places, that tension wasn't there. And I will say that restaurant is the only place that I ever received a 25-cent tip on I can't even remember. It was 4 or 5 people had like a full meal and left me a 25-cent tip. And, I don't think I was doing a horrible job, but I didn't deserve that 25-cent tip. But at the same time, I think I wasn't offering the same level of service as I was in those other restaurants either.
What's interesting is that it really ties back to what you were saying, which is like, what does success look like? Like, what is the vision of the restaurant that we want to have, and sort of that expression of our values? So if we value efficiency and getting through as many tables as possible, or do we value that our customers feel like they had sort of a family experience, or they had like a fine dining? Like, what does that picture of success look like? And does our team know that? And are they bought into it? So I thought that was a great way to start to tee up, your checklist.
Our next situation was written to us by a person who is concerned about a coworker who is being dishonest about their work. They write, I'm in a situation with a colleague who is severely underperforming and has been for at least a year. He has recently begun to lie about his work to others while in group settings. Other people believe him, while I know he is blatantly lying. Is this something you would still consider being radically candid about? We are peers who report to the same manager. Amy, what do you think?
The first question is this something you would still consider being radically candid about? Which I think is interesting as I hear you read it. Like, are we not wanting to be radically candid because of the lying, or we're not sure what's holding this person back? I think we absolutely want to be radically candid about it. I think the question is kind of how and why, like what are our goals of being radically candid? So if this person's lying about their work to others and we're aware of it, I think first of all, we do want to have a direct conversation. One of the things that we see so often is where people end up having conversations about other people or about situations rather than going directly to the source. So I think we do need to go directly to the source. The question then is like, why are we doing this? And kind of what's the harm being done? So I'd like to first understand, like, what is the harm of these lies being done, that it's impacting not just sort of reputation and not just sort of an affront to one sort of moral code around truth and lies, but is it actually harming the team? So Jason, yeah. I'll let you pick up on that.
I think the question of like, why are they worried about being candid about this, radically candid about it, is a really good one. I think if like reading through the email, there's a couple of things stand out to me. So from this person's perspective, the lying is blatant, but nobody else is catching it, or nobody else is saying anything about it. And so there's a lot of things going on here, and there could be an element of just, self-doubt also, of like, if this is so blatant, why aren't other people seeing, you know what I'm saying? Like there could be an element of like questioning yourself. And the other thing is, there could be a doubt that's caused by, if this is so blatant that other people must notice it, but they're willing to ignore it, am I not picking up on the signal? Like, why should I also be willing to ignore it? You know what I mean?
Was there a memo that went around that I missed of,
right.
Let's all agree. Yeah, I mean, to your point, like the first sentence is this person's been severely underperforming and has been for at least a year. And so there's kind of this impact on, I assume if they're peers, it's impacting their ability to do their work. But is there some resentment, or is there also some, why has this person been underperforming for a year and no one's been doing anything about it? And is the only reason we don't know that they're underperforming because they're lying? Like, are those two what other data are we missing here?
Yeah. And then I think there's also this question of what might be going on for this person that is causing them to lie. Because, I've worked with a lot of people over the course of, 20 plus years. And I don't think I've worked with a pathological liar. You know what I'm saying? I don't think I've worked with a person who intended to mislead other people and to do that regularly. In my shoes, I'd be looking at this pattern of lying and wondering, like, what is it that's going on for this person that is causing them to behave in this way? Because it seems he or she who wrote in the note does actually say they recently began to lie about their work. So it's not that they were always misleading people. This is like this is a new behavior. And so that part would give me pause. Like, that would make me curious. Like, what has caused this recent change in behavior? And I think for me, that's the in for radical candor, right?
Yeah.
I think that gives you the opportunity to approach with humility to say, I've noticed this change in behavior, or this change in my perception of your behavior. Here's the data that I have. This situation, you said this, and my understanding was that. And this is not something I've noticed you do before. Can you help me understand what's going on? Might be a way into that conversation, right? You might give that person the opportunity to share some information about what's going on.
Well, what I like about that, there's actually two pieces that you called out that I think is important. One is the sort of underperformance for a year, but the other is the recent, or at least the noticing recently about the lying. And the way that you frame that kind of challenge had the care of, this feels new to me. This is something I've just noticed. So you're basically saying something has changed here. Obviously, the underperformance hasn't changed that much in the last year, but the lying is a new behavior. And so rather than saying you're a liar, saying, something has changed and I just noticed this happened, and help me understand why.
And I think the reason why approaching with curiosity in this situation is worthwhile is, like, you don't really know what's going on for somebody else. And if the goal is to help this person, right? If you're actually following the sort of like principle of radical candor, the reason you're giving feedback or you're having this conversation at all is to help this other person, it helps to be curious, because I don't think people typically start lying because it's fun. I guess that's what I was trying to say before.
Yeah.
Like, unless you have like a psychological issue that you're dealing with, lying usually isn't fun. Misleading or lying to people is not something that most people enjoy. And so there's probably something going on there. The other thing that is notable about this, they're peers, right? And so there is this like really good question of, if you're not like genuinely interested in helping this person, like, why are you having this conversation? Because ultimately it's not your decision whether or not this person is going to continue to work in this role. I would find it really easy if I was in persons asking this question in their shoes to be really frustrated by the situation and essentially to be looking for an outlet for that frustration by confronting this person about their lies. That's probably not going to have the positive outcome that they're hoping for.
Yeah, it's such a great point, because when we think about, the model of radical candor and being humble and helpful, the helpful one really takes some time, because if you are frustrated and someone is doing something that to your mind is kind of going against your moral compass, it's really hard to come at it from this place of being helpful rather than kind of judgy and you've crossed a line here. So I think to your point, like, assuming this is someone that's lying for reasons that are beyond, intentional doing harm to other people, I could imagine a world where someone has been procrastinating and underperforming and other things are happening and they're feeling more and more kind of submerged and there's kind of no way out. So we don't really know the root cause here, but I think you brought up something that I would love to discuss in a broader way, which is peer-to-peer feedback, which is so challenging for so many of us, because that idea of being helpful, so often in peer-to-peer feedback, it usually is about, it's something I'm frustrated about or something I need from you and you're not delivering. And so just would love to kind of broaden it up to this idea of what you've seen work well from a peer-to-peer feedback perspective.
One thing that came up for me was there was actually a fairly famous case during the Great Recession of a person at a bank who made some bad investments and then told a small lie to cover up those bad investments. They like hid some of the money that they had spent in an account where no one would be looking at it. And then essentially like had to tell more and more lies to like prevent people from uncovering the original lie. And ultimately, like, bank wound up going out of business, wound up going into bankruptcy because the size of this bad debt, because they didn't identify it earlier and didn't move the money out of those investments, that wound up costing them billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why that story came to mind, why I think it's relevant here, is that that person did not have the intention of hurting other people. They did not intend for the bank to collapse. You know, none of that was intentional. It all started with a mistake in judgment, which was, I'm worried about getting in trouble for this, and so I'm going to try to hide it from other people, which is a very small error that had horrific consequences.
Well, it's such a great point. I'm thinking of Kim saying, you know, the cover up is sort of worse than the crime when she talks about her stories and she talks about her obnoxious aggression and once we've made a mistake and how do we handle and respond to the mistake. So I think this actually feels so relevant just in this moment that we're in. We were just talking about the wildfires in California and just how that little spark and how that actually starts to almost get out of control because we do one thing and rather than taking responsibility and ownership for the mistake, it actually sort of becomes something so much larger than we couldn't have imagined. If I can pause here and find a quote from Clay Christensen. Yep. He had such a great quote. Do you know what I'm talking about, Jason?
Yes. Many of us have convinced ourselves that we are able to break our own personal rules just this once. In our minds, we can justify these small choices. None of those things, when they first happen, feels like a life-changing decision. The marginal costs are almost always low, but each of those decisions can roll into a much bigger picture, turning you into the kind of person you never wanted to be. If you give in to just this once based on marginal cost analysis, you'll regret where you end up. That's the lesson I learned. It's easier to hold your principles 100% of the time than it is to hold them 98% of the time. The boundary, your personal moral line, is powerful because you don't cross it. If you have justified doing it once, there's nothing to stop you doing it again.
Well, A, thank you for finding that. And B, it gave me goosebumps. So Clay Christensen was my professor when I was at Harvard Business School. And he was really kind of this towering figure. I mean, literally, he was like, I think 6'8", and yet the gentlest soul. And he taught a class that I am proud to say was not my best class. It was Technology and Operations Management, or TOM. And it was a lot of process and things that didn't necessarily leverage my greatest thinking. But he was so kind and so patient, and I was really touched when I went back to my reunion a few years ago, and he, having suffered from some really challenging health issues, gave this talk to the returning alumni. And it was always, I mean, I think he just held this beacon of honor and morality, and it was very much about sort of how do you want to measure your life? And so while he's so well known for disrupting, you know, sort of disruptive innovation and really sort of reframing kind of the workplace, that's how I think of Clay. And I think maybe we can all learn by channeling our inner Clay Christensen when some of these moral dilemmas present for us.
Yeah. And I think to some extent, the question of peer feedback is a bit of a moral dilemma, right? Because you're kind of deciding, like, what kinds of relationships do you want to have with people and what kind of person do you want to be in the world? Because the most selfish way to look at giving feedback to peers is that if you share your perspective, both about what's working and what's not working, they're more likely to return the favor. Mm-hmm. That's like the best case scenario in terms of like direct value to you. There's indirect benefit in terms of like they might trust you more. It might be easier to collaborate with them. Depending on the nature of the peer relationship, those benefits can grow or shrink depending on the work that you're doing, right? Because if we're not collaborating closely, I'm not accruing any of that benefit. But there is this question of just like, how do you want to be in the world? And I think there's a little bit of that in the original question that was asked. Is this worth being radically candid about? And I think combining that with the Clay Christensen thing of like patience and morality is really valuable to say, there's a recognition of what this other person is doing as probably going against not just your moral code, but probably their moral code. Like I said, people are not super stoked about lying all the time. That's a very rare quality to run into. And approaching it in a way of patience and curiosity, I think actually has a chance of sparking something in that relationship. And if your goal, again, is to be helpful to them, even if your secondary goal is to improve the way that you collaborate and like make how easy it is to work with this person, but the primary goal of like helping them in this moment to see the impact of their behavior, because you assume that they don't want to harm other people, that act of kindness can have profound implications. Because I wonder what would have happened if, someone in the banking example had noticed what was going on and decided to approach this person in a kind way to say like, hey, I noticed this thing happened and that you moved this money into this other place. And I'm guessing you don't want to harm me, but like doing this is going to have, really bad consequences if we don't correct this problem quickly. You know what I'm saying? Like, who knows what could have happened? Like the bank could be around to sort of like fight another day. But clearly the reason why the person was covering this up is because of the fear that they had about how someone was going to react when they found out they made a mistake.
The orientation, especially around peer feedback that I heard you saying that really resonates with me is 4 words, which I find really powerful, which is how can I help? And really having how can I be of service? And to your point, it might be in service of the broader whole, because we believe that if we're helpful in being of service, we will actually all get more done together. But that orientation, if you can kind of hold someone while they're making a mistake and yet sort of have a hand on the back, like, how can I be helpful? Mm-hmm. To your point, like that could change banks and maybe even the world. Not to get too, kumbaya, But
what's the world through a grain of sand kind of a thing? I think we often underestimate the power of small actions to have. Every action we take has a ripple effect. We're always casting stones into the pond, right? And I think focusing on not only our intention, but the impact of those actions and seeing the opportunity to help someone else. I think it's really justifiable to see someone lie about their performance and be frustrated or annoyed with them. Part of the question that I would ask is like, what do you really want to have happen here? If you're going to approach this person, what is the positive outcome? The way that I think about this is like, if I'm not in a place where I can think of a positive outcome for both of us, not just for me, like where I can think of a positive outcome for both people, I wouldn't encourage you to have that conversation. You can't imagine a positive outcome. I think the situation has to be incredibly dire for me to go into it, even though I can't envision a good outcome for either one of us.
It's interesting. When you think about peer feedback, and I'm trying to figure out like why that almost feels harder. I mean, certainly we've talked about upwards feedback and why that's challenging. But I think what's hard is if you're kind of early in your career, or if you're just feeling like insecure in your role, there's often a very competitive kind of a zero sum. Well, if I'm being helpful to Jason, I'm somehow screwing myself over, or I'm just barely keeping afloat. Like, why do I want to be helpful to this person who's actually almost like adversary, competitor versus colleague? And I wonder like how we can maybe shift some of that thinking a little bit, but acknowledging that that's a reality for many of the people that are listening to us, or feeling like that their peer is thinking that about that. Like, oh, well, I want to be a good person, but this person's sort of ready to cut me off at the knees the first chance they'll get.
I'd simplify it even further to say, like, I think the calculus that people are doing is what's in it for me. When you're giving feedback up, there's a clear what's in it for you, which is like, you have to work with this person. They have control over your job, over your job and your livelihood. There's a very clear what's in it for me, especially if the feedback is about helping this manager help you be successful, right?
It's the Jerry Maguire.
Yes. Help me help you. It's much less clear in the peer cases. Like, that's what I was saying. Like, the primary benefits are all, first of all, they're delayed, because the way that this helps you is through building the relationship. That's the way that peer feedback helps you, if it's successful. But if it goes poorly, I think it's reasonable to say it could make the relationship worse and make my life harder. And if the upside isn't huge and the downside is pretty big, people have as we've discussed many times, a negativity bias. I'm generally going to say, like, I'd rather avoid the downside than take advantage of the upside. And I think that comes into play in giving feedback up as well. But in the peer case, it's just much harder to calculate the benefit to you. This came up for me a lot as a manager, especially on project teams, right? Which we knew the team was going to end at some point. And so what was the point of like giving each other feedback? From my perspective, the thing that moved people in the direction of giving one another feedback was an orientation towards a growth mindset, towards an acceptance of like making mistakes and learning to do better is the only way that we're going to collectively get better. And a feeling that getting better was actually going to make us all more capable of achieving our individual and collective goals. So there was this sense that growth and success were closely tied together. It makes the feeling that this person might be sort of undermining me or like I might be in competition with them less, because if the pie is growing quickly enough, right? If like everyone's growing fast enough, we're not likely to be in conflict with each other as much, right? There's just opportunities are appearing. In that world, in the world of like growth is valued and growth is happening in the organization, I think it's easier to get people to buy into peer feedback. I think in the world where like opportunity is shrinking, which is a situation we find ourselves in now, right? Jobs are disappearing, companies are laying off or furloughing people. Now I think there may only be one job for the two of us. And so why should I help you? There is a moral element to the question that was asked, which is, what kind of person do I want to be? If I see someone doing something that is harming themselves, having a negative impact on us, am I the type of person who's going to say something to that person about it? And then further, am I the type of person who's going to approach that with curiosity, or am I the type of person who's going to approach that with judgment and accusation? And I think the radical candor answer here is, look, if you believe that collectively we're much more likely to achieve our shared goals than we are if we sort of take that attitude of what's in it for me, you have to have some faith in that idea. And your faith is well placed, right? Research shows us that we are far more capable of achieving things collectively than we are of achieving things individually. And that the more complex a problem is that we're trying to solve, the greater the benefit of working together as opposed to working independently. And so if that's the situation you find yourself in, I think your faith that is true could be a motivator for you. So even if it's not about your life and like how you want to measure your life, I think like that could be another way to arrive at the same conclusion.
Well, if I can do another quote from Clay, and this is tailored towards managers, but I think since we're talking about peer feedback, I think it's really interesting to think about it in that peer-to-peer way. He wrote, I used to think that if you cared for other people, you need to study sociology or something like it. But I've concluded if you want to help other people, be a manager. And in fact, this is what he shared a version of this at the alumni session. He said, if done well, management is among the most noble of professions. You're in a position where you have 8 or 10 hours every day from every person who works for you. You have the opportunity to frame each person's work so that at the end of every day, your employees will go home feeling, and in this case, he says he's referring to Diana, felt on her good day, living a life filled with motivators. And I think the opportunity is, can we do this not just as managers, but as peers and as just people showing up with each other? If I've got 8 or 10 hours and I'm working with other people through a little video screen, will I feel like I did something that was in service of their growth and made me feel better at night? Or kind of that, which wolf will you feed in your heart? The wolf of, sort of love or hate or fear. So I think it feels very timely. And I think it's not just, if radical candor is not just for managers, I do think it's for humans. And how do you want to sort of show up at work and show up as a human?
So in my mind, the checklist for this question, it starts with, you need to understand what you want to have happen, right? Thing number one is you need to be able to envision a positive outcome. Because if you're going to bother having this conversation, you should at least be able to imagine that it could be of help to you and this other person to have it.
Yeah. And I think thing number two is based on an understanding of what you want to happen. What's your intention here? Is your intention to be helpful? Or is your intention to be, I'm pissed off and frustrated at this person and I want to give them a piece of my mind? So both of those might be true, but can we manage the emotion so that we can return to, how can I be most of service in this moment?
Thing number 3 is you need to have your own emotions in check. I've read real frustration in the way that this was written. You need to have your emotions in check enough that you can approach that conversation with curiosity, or you can approach that conversation with an energy that matches your intention. Because without that, I think you're setting yourself up for real frustration.
And if I can add, thing number 4 is maybe we can all be a little bit more like Clay Christensen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Be more like Clay.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com. We'll see you soon.